Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Well, very well, and we're going to deal with the problems of the world and have a little bit of positive news today. Hopefully it'll continue in the right direction. But we will, our main issue today, we want to talk about the Patriot Act. And you remember it well. We've worked on it for a long time. And after 9/11, within days, we had you come on the staff to help us out and understand all this. And that was your indoctrination, your introduction to the staff, is figuring out all the details of the Patriot Act. But I told you, we don't have a whole lot of, a disagreement on there. The Patriot Act doesn't look so hot, but that was your initiation into the congressional office.
Baptism by fire.
Right. And we'll deal with that, and there's some pros and cons, and once again, reform or get rid of it. And I think most people in our program, our supporters, would agree with us that, reforms aren't all that good, but sometimes a little reform can be helpful. It's better than not doing anything.
Yeah.
But before I get into that, I wanted to mention a little article. I see a little title, actually, and in a way it's a little bit funny. Biden now is looking like the kingpin.
Oh, yeah.
But he still has to worry about Sanders. But he's picking on what Hillary did in the last go-around and paint Sanders as not being likable.
Uh-oh.
So if he's unlikable, Biden must think he's very, very likable. And we should all feel better because Biden has come out for cleaning up the mess in Washington and restore ethical standards to Washington, D.C. So that's his tactics right now. But I'm just wondering whether you have an opinion on whether this is a good tactics. If he can prove that Sanders is unlikable, will this settle it?
Well, the funny thing is, on the campaign trail, how many times did Biden get into trouble? He called one guy fat, and he said something mean to a woman, and when he's not sniffing people's hair, he's insulting them. I think someone's got a likability problem. It's not only Sanders. Yeah.
Well, I sort of thought that there was a political advantage to approach it as trying to be likable anyway. And I always often thought, and other people have said it, that delivering babies and knowing their families made it easier to be likable.
Secret weapon,
even though we dealt with serious issues, I just think that likability is important, and people are more tolerable. And on a personal basis, we might say, we disagree here, but he's a really nice person, and we would work with. It's easier to do that, but that's not in politics now. Now it's who can be sometimes the nastiest and think they can get away with it. I hope there's going to be more to the campaign than that. Maybe they'll discuss socialism or something like that. But let's go ahead and talk about the Patriot Act. I remember the day the Patriot Act was passed. It was a very short time, within maybe 5 weeks or so of 9/11. It was brought to the floor. The one thing I was told, they said they could bring it quickly because it's been written.
Yeah, already written,
A while ago. It's been just sitting there waiting for the opportunity.
Yeah.
And so they didn't have to do too much. So the bill was ready, and they brought it to the floor, and it was overwhelmingly passed. I think there might have been a few of us on the Republican side that voted against it, but I can remember clearly. I can't remember the person, so I can't accuse anybody of anything. But I was sitting next to somebody that ordinarily would be sympathetic to not passing a bill like this, and he had voted for it, and I voted against. I said, "Why are you voting? You don't agree with that?" He says, "Oh, I agree. I don't agree with it." He says, "But how, under these conditions of post 9/11, how can I go home and explain it to my constituents why I didn't vote for the Patriot Act in this midst of this crisis?" I said, "Well, that's your job. You're supposed to go home and explain it to you." So, but it was serious business. There were several, and we've been fighting it ever since. And you were very much involved when we tried to get rid of the whole thing. It was supposed to be sunsetted at 10 years. So in 2011, it came up again. But I don't think we were very successful. They've been doing a lot of mischief since. But the one thing that we should always give credit to to calling attention to a serious matter is what Edward Snowden has done. Because they overstep the bounds, and actually governments don't even need a law to break. They just do what they want to do. I mean, they've been doing this for a long time. So once again, here we are, and I think there'll be significant votes in the Senate next week. It'll be in the Judiciary Committee, and some of the people that you would say would never consider, maybe some reforms, serious reforms and serious changes, are now a little bit ambivalent. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the momentum right now is in the direction to maybe curtailing some of this ruthless, unconstitutional authority that our executive branch exerts.
Yeah, and I'm sure you remember at the time when of course, they wanted a unanimous vote. They didn't want anyone to dissent at the time. But remember, their argument was, oh, these are just temporary measures in this extraordinary circumstances. Don't worry, we built in sunsets. Just when we get over this hump, everything will be fine. But as you know, whenever they ratchet up more government control and the crisis passes, it never ratchets down.
That's
it always
for sure.
stays ratcheted up. But what we're talking about is another deadline, March 15th. 3 provisions of the Patriot Act, the original Patriot Act that have survived reform, are now set to expire. And the question is, will Congress act to simply blanket reauthorize, will do a temporary reauthorization, or will it let them die, which is our preference? And I'll just go over the 3 really quickly because, you can really get into the weeds and it's not necessary. But the first is roving wiretaps, and that's where they can spy on a subject over multiple devices. You've got a couple of phones and this sort of thing. The problem with that is it does not really satisfy the particularity requirements of the Fourth Amendment. The second is the lone wolf. That means they can spy on a foreign national suspected of aiding international terrorism but not connected to a terrorist organization. There's another, but the third one and the big one, and we should probably talk about it in more detail, is Section 215, and that's where the government can collect your records, all communications, not the content of it, but the record of your calls and those things. And that's what was abused, and that's what Snowden showed us.
And I like your suggestion to watch how do you sort out and get out of the weeds. And I think there's a simple answer for that. If we would have followed the Fourth Amendment, that's not complex, is it? You just have to have an official legal warrant to snoop on people and spy on people. So that they ignore, and they make it much more complicated. For instance, FISA courts, I don't think there's a need for FISA courts. And, that might be one of the reasons why there's a little more sympathy for doing something about it, because, the conservative Republicans who typically would be hawkish, and there's still plenty of them, but they realized how the FISA courts were used to spy on Clinton, or on Trump.
Yeah.
All that. So the FISA courts, they essentially, I hope, if we didn't reauthorize the Patriot Act, I hope that would take care of it, but that needs to be taken care of too. All we have to do is pay attention and respect the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, that's probably the silver lining in the whole Trump impeachment, Russiagate nonsense, is that the president himself has been touched. And in a way, you can almost say he's a victim because of the falsification of the documents to allow the Carter Page surveillance, which essentially, because he was on the campaign team, it enabled them to spy on the entire Trump team. So Trump is a little bit sensitized to that. His heart may not have been in it otherwise, but he says now, and this is something that we saw this morning, this was originally on National Review, it's reporting on it, that Senator Paul is reporting from a conversation he had with the president that said the president made it exceedingly clear he will not accept a clean reauthorization without real reform. That's Senator Paul. And he continues. He was told by the Attorney General, we can massage around the edges and fix this through regulation, but the president didn't accept that. He pushed back very vigorously and said, we're not doing this. That's what Senator Paul said.
Well, that sounds good. That's another test, because I'm sure Rand is reporting this accurately.
Yeah.
But we still have to keep our fingers crossed a little bit because sometimes policies get changed. And Barr evidently is one that you can't fully trust as far as defending civil liberties in this country. So he wants to just pass the whole bill. So that certainly isn't going to be beneficial. But I do think that what went on with Russiagate and the FISA courts, it has awakened a lot of people. Yeah. So this is good information. After a period of time, you'd have to say, well, they shouldn't have passed it, and that was 2001, and now it's 20. That's what 19 years. 18 years. Yeah. So they're starting to wake up, but once again, not a lot of people have suffered from it, yet, but it's out there. And I think even Lindsey Graham made a statement, which he didn't say exactly what he was going to do, but he says, if they don't need it and they don't use it, why have it? And he mentioned $100 million they spent in a 5-year period of time, and I think they found 2 suspects or something like that. So it's too massive. It's just part of the runaway bureaucracy, and it's so tough reversing it because what they'll do is they're going to turn it around and say you don't care about national security. They'll have something come up, and they say, see, we needed that. We just got this information, and it's been helpful to us. Sort of like there's always an incident when they want to cut back a little bit of the military spending. But military spending always goes up when they're negotiating because there's another crisis somewhere.
And there's a good piece that I'm basing a lot of this on the Project on Government Oversight website, POGO. Jake LaPeroux wrote a good piece, and he reminds us that it was a Section 215, which is the biggie. That was what the NSA illegally, it turns out, used as the basis for the nationwide bulk collection of all our records, hundreds and millions. So when that came out, thanks to Ed Snowden, there was a narrowing of that in 2015, the narrowing of the collection. But as Jake writes in his piece, in 2018, the NSA used Section 215 to collect records from 19 million phone calls based on fewer than 50 targets. So this is how it works. There's a small group of 50 targets, but that person who they talk to and they talk to and they talk to, and this enables a broad, huge scope of collecting records, 19 million calls for just 15 people. That tells you how they can do this. And as you suggested earlier, this reminds me of the TSA. They say that the program has never helped detect or disrupt a single terrorist act.
The whole idea, though, is that you need this. They won't say these words, but they need it when you have an empire. You have to know what the enemy's doing. And the enemy might just be the people. And it turned out that, we had to deal with the enemy after 9/11. And here it turned out that the enemy was the people. The constitutional rights were taken away. We have to stop the jihadists. We have to stop this terrorism. We have to stop this. They don't talk about foreign policy, but they'll come and take away our freedoms. At the same time, our freedoms are taken away by our own representatives. But I think that's a known thing. Internally, you're more likely to lose liberties than somebody invading our country. So we can do it to ourselves. The one thing is, though, if people understand that, it should be more. It should be easier to deal with if we're doing it ourselves. Get rid of the people that are doing it to it. But then it becomes, the patriotic thing, and national security and patriotism. And if you do any resistance at all, and we heard it over the years, you're not supporting, national security, and you have to have all this money spent, all this spying, because there might be a bad person out there. So they throw away the Constitution. The thing that really bugs me, and I've said this before, is when those who are doing this to us, and you heard it during the Russiagate hearings, we need to do this. It's our constitutional duties to investigate and impeach Trump. This is what the Constitution tells us to do, And these are people who, couldn't even read the Constitution, let alone understand the limits that it places on our governments. And that's really what the Constitution is all about, is limiting government power, not to grant power. But it's been turned around. They read the Constitution saying, if there is not an explicit prohibition,
Yeah.
there's no prohibition, then you can do it.
Yeah.
And it's really the other way around. You can't do it unless you've had an explicit agreement to do it and authority to do it. But anyway, that's a bigger story, but it does affect this. And let's hope maybe the Senate will come up with a decent vote next week.
Yeah, and it's so disappointing. We still have this mentality, hey, I've got nothing to hide, I've got nothing to hide. And it is so disappointing. At the same time, people will ask, well, how did people just sit by in Germany in the 30s, in the Soviet Union in the 20s? How could they just sit by and watch the government take away all their freedoms? Well, this is exactly it. They probably all sat there and said, well, we've got nothing to hide, we've got nothing to hide. Next thing you know, you've got nothing to keep secure.
That's right. And people have done that throughout the many years, the centuries. And I think that comes from a fallacy called the government's responsibility to make us safe.
Yeah.
And that's not it. The government can't make us all safe. I mean, you'd have to have a police guard at every house to keep the bad people out, and yet they'd be the bad people because you wouldn't have freedom of movement. That making us safe means that they'd have to know every single thing. That doesn't mean you can't have a national defense and say that, if the tanks are lining up or the planes are coming, that you can't defend the country. But that isn't what they're talking about. You have to be safe for social reasons, all kind of speech reasons and cultural reasons. Make you safe, you can't do that. This is what motivates people to tell you about your habits. Oh, religious habits and sexual habits and other habits. We have to regulate them because we want to make you safe from yourself.
Yeah.
That's when it really gets bad. The government's supposed to make us safe from other people, but then when they get into stuff that we have to make you safe so that you don't hurt yourself, and then there's nothing left once they have that role, and they do have that role. That's what socialism really endorses, these principles. And you listen to these so-called socialists now, it is authoritarian at its worst, and they're going to make you safe and secure and happy and rich, and everything will be free.
Free, yeah, that's right.
Not freedom, free. Nobody has to pay.
Freedom isn't free. Well, I'm gonna close with a quote from one of our favorite people. But before I do that, I just want to, again, because it's been a couple days since I've bugged you all about it, but we want to see you in Houston in May. It's a nice time of year in Houston. It's not too hot yet, and it's a great place to get some great food, but it's a great place to hear talks on a very important topic, which is the war on speech, another one of our freedoms that are really under attack. We've got a great group of speakers. In fact, next week, I'll announce our speakers for the conference. I'll keep you in suspense. But go to ronpaulinstitute.org/conference and get your tickets now and be one of the first, be one of the coolest kids on the block. But I want to close, Dr. Paul, with a quote from one of our good friends, Judge Napolitano, who we're honored to have on our board as well. It's a piece he does about get rid of the Patriot Act, repeal the Patriot Act. And just to back up a little, he talks about Section 215 and Section 505. We didn't talk about 505 today, but this is the section that allows the agents rather than judges to issue warrants. And that's a real big one. But here's a great quote from the judge on these two. Both 215 and 505 are weapons of mass surveillance and should be repealed. They are instruments of a totalitarian government, not of free people. They defy the Constitution. They presume that our rights are not natural, but come from a government that can take them back. Mass surveillance produces a state that knows more about us than we do about it, one that will slowly consume our freedoms in the name of government needs. It already has. Great talk from the
Very
judge.
good.
Yeah.
And the principle there is what we're talking about is the protection of privacy. And that's what you're supposed to have in a free society. Matter of fact, privacy is freedom. And yet privacy wasn't mentioned in the Constitution. That became a big thing to debate. Well, privacy isn't even in the Constitution, but freedom is. And agreements and contracts and property and all these things are protected. But privacy is the real issue. Privacy implies property, and property implies just almost everything you have to deal with as far as freedom of speech goes. So if you have a church or synagogue or any kind of a business or party or whatever, or your own home, that's private property, and you can do and say whatever you do if you're not, harming other people. And so privacy protects freedom of speech. Sometimes people get very confused, and hopefully our little conference we're going to have will explain some of this. But it doesn't mean that you can say anything anytime you want. Nobody can walk into a TV station and say, hey, this is freedom of speech. I want to be on your program. Sometimes it gets carried away, and there were laws that said equal access to radio station. But privacy and property really takes care of a lot of things. You say, well, what about the Second Amendment? It would take care of it. Your property, your gun, you can protect. One rule. You're not allowed to initiate force and violence against other people. And believe me, the world would be a lot safer and a lot more prosperous. We would have peace and prosperity if we could follow a few simple rules and pay attention to the rule of law as the founders had hoped we would with writing the Constitution. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.